Hi, my name is Therese Huston, and I'm the author of the new book, Let's Talk, Make Effective Feedback Your Superpower. In the time that we have today, I want to talk about giving remote feedback. Many of us are working from home, and so are our employees, which means that when we need to have a constructive feedback conversation, we're doing it remotely. And for most of us, that is much harder than doing it in person. So I'm going to give you two of my favorite tips for giving remote feedback. But first, let's talk about what it's like to give feedback remotely. For most of us, it's much harder, and it's much harder every step of the way, right? Before you give the feedback, you might be dreading the conversation and feeling a lot of anxiety about it. During the conversation, it can be so much harder to read the other person, which just means that your anxiety isn't going away. It keeps circling and circling. And then after the conversation, even that's hard because you're not sure that the other person understood you correctly or that they're taking away the message that you were hoping they would get. Now let's talk about two strategies to improve your remote feedback conversations so that this is more effective for the other person and less stressful for you. The first step is something you do early in the conversation, and that is say your good intentions out loud. This seems like an unnecessary step, but it makes a big difference. Research by Leslie John, she's a management professor at Harvard Business School, indicates that when someone who's giving bad news says their good intentions out loud before they give the bad news, the other person is much more receptive to the bad news and it doesn't make them nearly as upset. Now, what would that look like in a feedback conversation? It could be as simple as saying, I want good things for you, or it might be very specific. It might be something like, I want other people to see you as the expert that I know you are. And then you give the harder news. The second step is something that you would do at the end of the conversation to drive clarity. And that is to simply ask the other person, what are your takeaways? So you could ask, what are your three takeaways from this conversation? Or you could say, what do you hear me saying? And that gives the other person a chance to say what they're hearing, and it gives you a chance then to clarify if there were any misunderstandings. Now, one of the reasons this is important is people tend to end remote feedback conversations much more abruptly than they would ever end them in your office. And in fact, when you say, what are your three takeaways, the other person might say, oh, I've got a dog emergency, or they might say, I need to go tend to my son. That's fine. That happens. So you say, no problem, but before the end of the day, could you take a few minutes just to send me an email with your three key takeaways? And it gives you an opportunity that's close enough to the feedback conversation that you can clarify any misunderstandings. So those are two key steps that you can try right away that should improve your feedback conversations. I'm Therese Huston, and you can make effective feedback your superpower.